Hello, everyone. The case I chose to learn more about is a landmark case for special education, and it is the Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia, which took place in 1972. I chose this case because it was instrumental in making much needed changes for children with special needs. In learning more about how special education is operated today, I feel this case was on the forefront for what we know as rules and laws in today's world for special education students. This is one of three cases that help pave the way for the rights of all children, and especially those in special education. The Mills case involved a young boy named Peter Mills and 6 other children, and it was against the District of Columbia's school board. To better understand the Mills case, I feel some review of history is needed to fully grasp the impact of the Mills case. There have been many battles fought for children with disabilities. The 3 cases prior to the Mills case that I feel impacted the Mills case was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1971. In Plessy versus Ferguson, Homer Plessy, an African-American man who could pose as a white person, sat on the whites-only railroad train car and refused to move. The lawsuit came about, and actually Homer Plessy lost the lawsuit. The courts supported the separate but equal standard and that it was okay for this to continue. This became a standard defense for school districts for segregation, and the racial lines were clearly drawn. Some 50 years later, in another landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education, this case in 1954 was a landmark case for civil rights in the United States and brought about the destruction of segregation in schools in America. During the Brown case, the United States Supreme Court unanimously overturned Plessy, stating that segregation of children in schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So separate but equal was invalid. No longer could we have segregation across the United States. You can imagine this was a huge movement for racial boundaries and, of course, made headlines. This had a big impact across the country. However, sad news followed. Although desegregation started, the rights of children with disabilities continued to be overlooked. The Brown case would become a foundation for parents of children with disabilities to build upon. In the 1950s, some states did not allow disabled people to vote, to marry, or even get a driver's license. More than half of the states required sterilization of people with disabilities. Disabled people had limited rights. Although this case provided equal education for all students, it would be almost another 20 years before this equal education would be supplied with children with disabilities. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act would provide financial means to improve the education of students in certain categories, one of these being children with disabilities. However, prior to 1975, states were not obliged to provide detailed special education for students with disability. As a result, because there was no accountability, this opened the door to much litigation in the fight for the rights of disabled children. In 1971, the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children brought about a lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This case is known as the Park case. It is another landmark case that helped pave the way for disabled children. During this time period, it was discovered that millions of children with disabilities were not allowed to attend public schools or were not properly educated in the public schools. These children had rights. The Park case involved 14 children with disabilities that had been denied a public education. The case argued that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This landmark case certainly paved the way for disabled children, but there was still room for improvement. Soon after Park, in the very same year, the Mills case came about. The Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia is the third major landmark case laying the grounds for disabled children. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, this involved a young boy named Peter Mills and 6 other children. All 7 of these children had mental, behavioral, or physical disabilities. These disabled children were suspended, expelled, and excluded from a public education. The grounds for the lawsuit were based on due process. The students were not given due process. The families had a right to notice of changes and access to school records on their child, and a right to be heard as well as a right to an attorney. Peter Mills's family and 6 other families started the lawsuit and came together to fight for the rights of their children. Before 1975, many special education students were just thrown together into a generic special education classroom. Special education students were segregated and often in trailers in the basements of buildings. As a result of the Mills lawsuit, the District of Columbia did concede that they had a legal duty to support all residents in public education, but they argued that it was impossible for them to do because they did not have the necessary financial abilities. The court noted that funds would need to be found and delegated equally so that no child is excluded from a public education. The district estimated that over 12,000 students were not served that year due to budget concerns. As a result of the Park and Mills cases, Congress launched an investigation of children with disabilities and discovered millions of children were not being properly educated. They uncovered that 1.7 million children were receiving no educational services and that 2.5 million children were not receiving an appropriate education. At this time, Public Law 94-142 was enacted into law in 1975 and was named the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which was reauthorized in 1990 and again in 2004. The IDEA mandated a free and appropriate public education for all students, even those with disabilities. The Mills case, along with Park and the Brown case, helped pave the way for children with disabilities and also the rights for all students. Both Park and Mills were very important to how the laws would change to help children with disabilities. The Mills case was far-reaching and definitely helped pave the way for how special education is handled today. As a result of the Mills case, 20 more federal cases followed, giving pressure of federal laws to protect all children. Every student should have equal access to a quality education. In closing, the Mills versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia has certainly been instrumental in paving the way for the rights of disabled children, but it is also important to know that the Brown case and the Park case was also instrumental in giving our children their rights in today's world. As educators, it is important to understand and be familiar with the history of education, educational litigation, and changes along the way. By possessing this knowledge, it can help us ensure that we are giving every student a free and appropriate education.